everybody for coming and attending our conference. On behalf of CAIR Arizona, I am Imran Siddiqui. I'm the chairman of the chapter. And before we get the program started, we want to go ahead and start off with the recitation of the Quran. So we'll start off with that with Abdullah Ajmeri. He'll recite for a few minutes. So bear with us.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله لنريه من آياتنا إنه هو السميع البصير. وآتينا موسى الكتاب وجعلناه هدى لبني إسرائيل ألا تتخذوا من دوني وكيلا ذرية من حملنا مع نوح إنه كان عبدا شكورا. وقضينا إلى بني إسرائيل في الكتاب لتفسدن في الأرض مرتين ولتعلن علوا كبيرا. فإذا جاء وعد أولاهما بعثنا عليكم عبادا لنا أولي بأس شديد فجاسوا خلال الديار وكان وعدا مفعولا. ثم رددنا لكم الكرة عليهم وأمددناكم بأموال وبنين وجعلناكم أكثر نفيرا. إن أحسنتم لأنفسكم وإن أسأتم فلها. فإذا جاء وعد الآخرة ليسوءوا وجوهكم وليدخلوا المسجد كما دخلوه أول مرة وليتبروا ما علوا تتبيرا. صدق الله العظيم.
Okay, so Jazakallah khair, Abdullah. So now, let's go ahead and get the conference started here. So we'd like to welcome all of you to this conference, American Wild Muslim. This has been part of the promise that CAIR Arizona has made to the community. When we launched the chapter about a year and a half ago, we not only wanted to fight for the civil rights of the community, we not only wanted to take your cases and all that sort of thing, the bread and butter of what we do, we wanted to also be a source of bringing empowerment, education, and being able to bring the experts in their respective fields over here and bringing a higher level of education to the community as well. So I think we've done that with this conference. We have a great docket of speakers that are going to be speaking today, and the title of the conference is American Wild Muslim. So what exactly does that mean? Basically, we're highlighting the experiences that Muslim Americans are facing in society today. The struggles, whether it's with Islamophobia, whether it's with issues with law enforcement issues, in terms of, like being disaffected politically, that type of thing. So what is the current environment right now? But also we're going to project some solutions as well. This is a very positive conference we're going to have here. So we're bringing people from all different realms. We're going to have leaders of the community. We're going to have, so the local Phoenix community we'll have people from all over the country who have unique experiences and unique perspectives and how they were able to overcome these issues. So I'm not going to make this introduction too long because we're a little bit behind on time. So the first session is actually just defining what does American Wild Muslim mean. I brought in one of my great colleagues and friends, Zahra Bilou. She's from CAIR, San Francisco Bay Area. She's the executive director. She's an attorney as well. Very well-known grassroots organizer across the country, a very big advocate for getting women speakers involved in Muslim panels as well. She coaches me on that quite a bit. So we're really honored to have her here. And Zahra, if you can come up, and we'll go ahead and get started here.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. My name is Anisa Nadir. I serve as the president of the Islamic Social Services Association and also have a legal services business, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session. You've already had a pre-introduction by Brother Imran. He took my job, so I don't have much to say except to say that we are very happy to have Sister Zahra here, and she serves as the executive director of CAIR, San Francisco Bay Area. She's also a licensed attorney in the state of California, and she's an avid baker. And so without further ado, I'd like to bring Sister Zahra up so that she can begin her presentation. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Before I talk to you about being American or Muslim, Imran brought this up, and I actually wanted to say something that I shared with him last night. One of the things that I do when I'm not wearing my CAIR hat is work with the community to ensure adequate representation of female leaders and female speakers, both in the management of our organizations, but also in our programs. I think it's really important that when our community, and especially our young people, attend our programs, that they feel that they can connect with the speakers. And as someone who grew up in California in the 80s and 90s, I frequently felt like there were no women role models. Sometimes when I'm talking to my Asian American and African American colleagues about being a lawyer, the question that comes up is, well, who were your role models? And I think, I had the role models in the lives of the Prophet, peace be upon him. I had the women that followed those generations. I had my mom and others, but there weren't community leaders. When I went to programs, I frequently didn't feel like I could connect with the speakers because they didn't look like me, they didn't know my experiences. And so I want to commend Arizona. This is my second time here in 2 years, and there are other programs that I frequently get updates about, and it seems to me like Arizona is leading the way on ensuring that there are always women in these programs, whether it's banquets or conferences. So give yourselves a round of applause. Part of being American while Muslim for me means creating our own narrative and setting out who we are and defining who we want to be. And what's really important there is giving our young people role models to look up to, allowing them to connect to the people on stage, both during the program and after the program. And so thank you for leading the way on that. And I come from California, so calling Arizona progressive is sort of not something I would expect to be doing, but that's what I'm saying here. So feel free to hold me to it. Yeah, Arizona Muslims, correct. And so I was asked to talk today about being American while Muslim and what that means. And so I wanted to share a little bit about myself and what it's meant for me, and then talk about some of the issues facing my community. My parents migrated to the United States in the 70s, and they were about my age. And sometimes when I think to myself, what would it be like to take everything you own, put it in a suitcase, and move halfway across the world to a place where maybe you speak a little bit of the language, maybe you understand a little bit of the culture, but no one really believes what you believe, no one understands where you come from, you're a stranger. And I remain in awe of the immigrant generation who did that, right? Who came over and said, we want to be a part of this country. And some of them came over because they were seeking political asylum, some because they were seeking religious freedom, and others because they were seeking economic opportunities. Of course, there's an entirely separate discussion to have about them seeking economic opportunities here because of what we were doing to their countries, what we were doing to their economies. And I start with my parents' immigration not to leave out the fact that American Muslims have been, or the Muslims have been in this country since its founding. I think that this doesn't get said enough, that at least one third of the slaves that were brought over to the United States during the horrific slave trade. We so frequently talk about the human rights violations that happen in other countries without acknowledging our own participation in human rights violations. That's part of this country's legacy. Were themselves Muslim, that they were taken from their homes, that they were kidnapped, that they were sold like cattle to people who forced them to change their religion, forced them to change their names, wouldn't let them congregate, wouldn't let them learn to read, right? These very basic rights. And so many of them lost their religion, some held on. And so we saw various resurgences of Islam in the African American community, and I think that any conversation about being American or Muslim that doesn't acknowledge that is incomplete. And then you had the wave of immigration. So my parents came over here in the 70s. When they came over here, they knew Islam as a culture. They didn't know Islam as a religion in maybe the way we practice it today. I love my parents for the fact that they taught me our religion as they came into it themselves, but it always fascinates me to hear that the stories of we wear headscarves sometimes on special occasions when it's Eid, right? It wasn't a conscious decision of yes, I wear a headscarf or no, I don't, which I think are conscious religious decisions. It was a cultural thing that happened at events. I pray 5 times a day, but I do it all at the end of the day because as long as I get them in, it doesn't really matter. And again, that's not to belittle praying, but rather that it was cultural, that it was just something that they did without really thinking about. I don't have children, I have a cat, which I love. But I'm told it's sometimes very similar and sometimes very different. And for my parents, having children was what really brought them into the religion, right? This idea that, okay, well, we're here to stay. And now we have to figure out what this religion means to us, because whatever it means to us, we want to convey to our children. And so they came into learning about the religion. And a lot of times when we talk about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment, we talk about it as a post-9/11 reality. We neglect the fact that during the Iran hostage crisis, there was Islamophobia, that during the 80s and 90s, as Hollywood decided to explore the concept of Muslim terrorists, there was Islamophobia. And so they raised Muslim youth during that period, that it's important to recognize that organizations like the Islamic Society of North America, like MAS, like CAIR, came up during that era. Because there's always been a vision of what it means to be American while Muslim. Sometimes my generation critiques the elders by saying they didn't have this vision, that they always had 1 foot in the other country and 1 foot here, and I would argue that maybe it was 1.5 feet here, feet, and then the other half in the other country. And I don't think that we can fault them for always connecting with home, right? For always wondering if they'd go back, for caring about their brothers and sisters in other countries. But they started to lay the foundations here. And so for me as a young American Muslim woman, I made the choice to wear a headscarf. I made the choice to be an outspoken activist on behalf of my religion, recognizing that it was my religion that taught me to do that. I made decisions about feminism, right? What it meant to be a woman in America and how it paired up with what it meant to be a Muslim woman. I pursued an education and I came to CAIR. And people sometimes ask why I came to CAIR, or what my introduction to CAIR was, and what exactly it is that we do. Because a lot of people don't realize what we do or the issues that we're working on, not because they don't care, but because there's just so much information these days, especially in the era of social media, where there's 1, if not 2 or 3 or 100 emails a day, plus Twitter, plus Facebook. So how do you keep up? How do you absorb? I was at a conference recently, and HBO Def Jam poet Amir Suleiman said to the audience, he said, I want to thank you for caring. That, and I don't mean care C-A-I-R, I mean C-A-R-E. I want to thank you for caring. And that struck me. I was like, why? Yeah, we should care. And he went on to explain that there's so much going on today that it gets difficult to care. That baseline is sometimes the hardest thing. And for me as an activist, it frequently comes back to the teaching that, if you see something wrong, you change it with your hand. And if you can't change it with your hand, you change it with your tongue. And if you can't change it with your tongue, you hate it in your heart, and that's the lowest level. Hating it in your heart is difficult to do, right? When you hear about people dying every day, when FBI visits in our community are normal, when Robert Spencer might as well have his own television channel at Fox News, it becomes difficult to hate it with your heart. We become desensitized, we stop caring. And so what are the issues that our community is facing today? And how have they evolved in the last couple of generations? I mentioned that when we talk about Islamophobia, we frequently think of it as a post-9/11 thing, but that's not true. Islamophobia didn't begin on September 12th, 2001. The Patriot Act, many would argue, was written before September 12th, 2001, ready to go. And so the idea that we're afraid of the other is something that has existed in our history. It's something that we've done to other communities, and that really, I'm surprised it took Muslims this long for us to get our turn, right? And so we're writing it out, and what does it mean? The one other thing I will say about the pre-9/11 community is that one of the things about the immigrant generation, the immigrant community, was that they came to the United States seeking better opportunities, seeking to make their families more successful, and some of that meant not rocking the boat. Actually, a lot of that meant not rocking the boat. We would raise doctors, engineers, and business people. They wouldn't question the government, they'd pay their taxes, they'd keep their heads down, they'd maybe go to the masjid, right? But no political activity, no outward engagement. And we actually frequently even dissuaded people from extroverted careers, right? One would say that yes, engineers, doctors, and business people communicate with others, and I'm not at all downplaying those careers. And they are extroverted in some ways. They deal with clients, they deal with patients, right? But we weren't raising social workers, journalists, lawyers. We just didn't see those careers as relevant. We also weren't engaging with our allies. Some people were, and again, the African American community has been a huge leader in this, right? Is that some people were, but for the most part, as a larger American Muslim community, we weren't engaging with allies. We weren't present when the war on drugs was depriving black and brown people of their rights. Did American Muslims speak out during World War II when we sent Japanese Americans to concentration camps? I don't know, right? But for the most part, our voice hasn't been present. And what's really interesting to me when we talk about sort of these longer discussions about Israel and Palestine and various other organizations is that the Jewish American community has consistently been present on struggles that haven't been theirs, right? When we talk about African American civil rights, they did come out. They did come out and say, hey, this matters. Like, we know what this looks like. And I would say that there are a lot of times lessons that we can learn from these communities, and I'll get to the lessons in a little bit. But again, what are we facing? The first couple of years post 9/11, we saw a rise in Islamophobia. We saw hate crimes and hate incidents. And the thing that I always say about hate crimes that I think is the most tragic to share is that the people who commit hate crimes frequently don't know the difference between a Catholic Mexican American and a Pakistani Muslim American. They frequently don't know the difference between a Indian Sikh American and a Kashmiri Muslim American. And unfortunately, many of our allied communities have suffered as a result of people who are committing hate crimes because they are violent and misguided, but also because they're just so ignorant. Like, it's embarrassing that they're that dumb. That said, so we saw a rise in hate crimes and hate incidents. We saw employment discrimination going through the roof, right? Employment discrimination continues to be an issue facing the Muslim community. As an employment attorney, one of the things that I feel strongly about is that you should never have to choose between your hijab, your beard, Friday prayer, and feeding your children, right? That it should never be that I took off my headscarf because I was worried I wasn't going to get a job, right? Or that my employer calls me a camel jockey and a sand whatever, and all of these names that I can't even say up here, right? And that's what so many people are encountering in the workplace. Our children are frequently, I think, forgotten, and I don't mean to say that we forget them and that we don't take care of them or that we don't, fund their programs, but we frequently don't think about how Islamophobia impacts them, right? Imagine being 7 or 8 years old and your teacher talking about the 10th anniversary of 9/11 in your classroom and saying, well, the people that did it were Muslim because they said their religion taught them to do this, right? No nuanced conversation about what causes terrorism, no nuanced conversation about what other Muslims have said. But you're just, a middle schooler in your classroom. You're afraid to speak up. And those are sometimes the voices that we don't hear in these communities. Again, mentioning partners, the Sikh community and even the LGBT community have led the way on dealing with school bullying, right? Irrespective of your faith, your sexual orientation, your race, or gender, we can agree that if you're 7 or 8, if you're 9 or 10, if you're in high school, that you should feel safe at school, right? That you should never be compromised in any way. And we've seen some really horrific incidents in some of these communities, young people committing suicide because the bullying was just so severe and they didn't know where to go for help. And I'm thankful that there haven't been any major stories of Muslim youth committing suicide. But I'll tell you that we've heard from Muslim youth who have said that they are suicidal, right? That they don't know where to go for help. They're afraid to talk to their parents. They're afraid to go to their teachers. And the last thing that I want to touch on is law enforcement harassment and government harassment. When we talk about civil rights violations, I think that we frequently think of people who are racist towards us, right? People who don't want us in their restaurants, people who don't want to employ us, maybe teachers who say misguided things. We think of hate crimes. We sometimes think that we can turn to the government for help, that we should be able to call them if there is a civil rights violation, that I should be able to turn to the local police department. Again, maybe not in Arizona, with all due respect, but that we should be able to turn to the local police, or not in Maricopa County, but that we should be able to turn to the local police department and ask for help. And what's most troubling is when we learn that it is the police department itself that is frequently pushing forward Islamophobia. When our elected officials who fund the police departments are making Islamophobic comments, when the law enforcement agents that we want to call for help are participating in law enforcement trainings and then surveilling and entrapping entire squads of the Muslim community, right? That they're mapping out where the Muslims live, what restaurants they go to. In case you're ever visiting New York, I've heard that there's actually a really great restaurant guide that's been, I guess, described and detailed and written out based on the NYPD's files. So if you want to know where the NYPD thinks you find good Muslim food, there's a guide that exists like that. And it's funny, I mean, and it didn't exist the last time I went to New York, but you know, I would recommend that you check it out. And at the same time, it's so problematic, right? That how I feel about falafel or like what I think about who actually created hummus like should actually reflect on what law enforcement, you know, feels about me. But not just that, like whether I mean, if I grow a beard, then law enforcement might definitely have some questions, but you know, whether or not someone grows a beard or how strongly we've heard things like how strongly they feel about monotheism, right? Like how strongly they feel about the oneness of God, how they feel about Israel and Palestine, how they feel about Iraq and US foreign policy impacts how law enforcement agents interact with our community. And so I won't say more about law enforcement because there's actually an entire segment on it and there's a great book for sale outside about the law enforcement issues. But these are some of the issues that we're facing. I don't want to end on a depressing note because that's always important, right? That you never want to leave a session upset or sort of feeling downtrodden about our reality. And we've got a whole day talking about opportunities and things that we can do as a community. But I also want to say that despite all of the challenges, many have said that the Muslim community is in a golden era in the United States today. That we finally have 2 elected Congress members, right? And they represent their constituencies in Indiana and Minnesota, but they also look like us, right? They connect with us, they understand what we're talking about, we can hold them accountable. We also have dozens, if not hundreds and thousands of elected officials across the country, school boards, city officials, local congress members, senators who want to hear what the Muslim community is saying. They want our money, don't get me wrong, they want your donations, they also want your votes. And that gives you an opportunity to hold them accountable, right? Is that you have elected officials of other faiths who are coming out and condemning Islamophobia. In San Francisco this year, we passed a resolution, the first of its kind in the country, where the Board of Supervisors in the County of San Francisco condemned Pamela Geller and said that her bus advertisements were Islamophobic and not welcome in the city, right? That the city made such an official statement gives us hope, gives us the opportunity to say, hey, there is room for growth. People talk about mosques being attacked, and they are being attacked, and it's difficult to construct a mosque. They say if you think your community likes Muslims, try to construct a mosque and see. That's the ultimate litmus test. And despite that, mosques are growing by the dozens, right? Just in the last 10 years, they've continued to grow. So in many states in this country, there are multiple mosques in each city. You have choices as to where to go pray. You want to go to a Sunni mosque, a Shia mosque, a Pakistani mosque, a Bosnian mosque. And it's not to say that we should be segregated, but that you have all of these options, right? And so I want to leave you on this note and ask that today you spend time considering what you can do to get involved in contributing towards this golden era, right? What can you do to make the positive change? I said that maybe people had 1 foot here and 1 foot in another country, maybe 1.5. Today, we have 2 feet planted here. We have people in Hollywood, we have people in the halls of Congress, we have people in the courts, we have people in university campuses. I'll tell you that yesterday, I was humbled and surprised to learn that the department chair for the department that we were visiting at the University of Arizona was a Muslim. And I thought, you know, it was so rare to have Muslim professors and Muslim teachers, and now you have Muslim department chairs. And so as you go through this day, make a commitment to yourself to do something different starting tonight and tomorrow. If you're already doing something, thank you, do more. If you don't think you're doing enough, do more. There's always room to do more. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you, Sister Zara. Refreshing. You reminded me of my dissertation work, the history of Islam in America and the diversity of the Muslims in America. You know, I really appreciate you acknowledging the history of the African American community, as well as the immigrant community and the descendants of both communities. You know, that's where we are today. I also appreciate you acknowledging the role of the social worker, as I am a social worker and a professor, a former retired professor, so I appreciate very much both of those. We now, and also you reminded me of the opportunity I had to do some research on the identity of Muslims in America, and particularly young Muslim women. So thank you very much for that. We have a few minutes for questions, for Q&A, not dissertations. It's not dissertation time, but an opportunity for you to ask a question of our dear sister. and to get some, maybe some more information about maybe next steps, where we go from here. We ran out of time. Okay, it was my understanding we had 5 to 10 more minutes. So she'll be around, so you'll have an opportunity to ask her questions in the course of the day. And it's time for us now to move on to the next session. So without further ado, we'll step aside. Thank you.
Actually, Zara is going to be here for a few more sessions, so there's going to be a lot more time during the day for Q&A, so don't worry about that. We'll be answering lots of questions. But yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Anisa Nadir as well. I didn't let her introduce the session, but she's a pioneer in our community. She was actually one of the early members of CAIR Arizona in its earliest iterations as well. So we really appreciate her work and her pioneering effort here as well. As we now are transitioning over to the next session, this is going to be a treat here. I'm going to call up our intern Liban Yusuf, and he's going to introduce the next session inside the Terror Factory with Trevor Erickson.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We're very blessed today, and we're very lucky to have joining us Trevor Erickson. He's the author of the Inside the Terror Factory. This is a groundbreaking book that has uncovered key tactics that have been employed by the FBI under the guise of the war on terror. Trevor's expose uncovers how the use of informants, agents, and manufactured plots have become commonplace tactics in a national security enterprise. So, like I said, we're very lucky to have Trevor here with us today. His book is available outside, and we encourage everybody to go and read the book. But without further ado,
one second for a technical issue. I can't see the screen for you guys.
we can see you, but
Okay, well I guess that's enough then.
yeah.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, okay. Well, thank you everyone for having me. I'm really sorry I can't be in Phoenix with you. I was really hoping to be there. So thanks so much to CAIR for accommodating me here and making this possible. What I thought I'd do is tell you a little bit about my research, about my book, and hopefully leave a lot of time for questions if you have any. You know, my book, The Terror Factory Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism, looks specifically at the FBI's role in infiltrating, for lack of a better term, Muslim communities in the United States, and then using informants of very questionable background to find would-be terrorists. And to give you an idea of how this works, I'll tell you a story about a man outside Chicago named Derek Sharif. Derek was a recent convert to Islam who, as a result of adopting the religion, had ostracized his family. His family no longer had anything to do with him, and at the same time, Derek found himself in a pretty bad life spot. He didn't have a place to live. He was living in a car that was broken down, and he was working at a video game store making close to minimum wage. We don't know exactly why the FBI chose to target him, but what we do know is that the FBI sent in an informant who was a convicted drug dealer and who was working with the FBI on an undercover basis as an informant. They sent him in the day before Ramadan to get to know Derek, and he strikes up conversation with Derek in the video game store, and during this quick conversation, they become essentially fast friends, and the informant offers Derek a place to live, says, you know, I have a car that I don't use very often. Since yours is broken down, you're welcome to use it, and you can stay in my place, eat my food until you're back on your feet. And Derek, being newly religious, but also as a part of that, seeing himself as very devout, thought this was the act of God, and you know, particularly since this was the day before Ramadan, he thought this was definitely the work of God, and decided to go and live with Derek. And over the course of months, the informant inspired in Derek what violence he had. Derek, for whatever reason, was an angry man. He just didn't know how to direct that anger. And in conversations with the informant would say to him, "Well, let's go do something. Let's take your anger. Let's take your anger at American foreign policy and do something about it." And Derek, you know, kind of in his naivety, says at one point, you know, I think we should kill a judge. And of course, Derek doesn't even know the name of the judge. And so the informant says to him, "Well, how about a more manageable path? Let's try something that you can actually pull off." And he suggests that they acquire grenades and attack a shopping mall on Christmas Eve. And as you can imagine, I think this would be a terrible terrorist incident if someone were to attack a crowded shopping mall on Christmas Eve with grenades. But a problem for Derek was that he didn't have any grenades, and so the informant says to him, "Well, I know an arms dealer who can sell you grenades." And this is where the FBI sting operation really takes a wild turn, because the FBI agent who was working the case and the informant who was becoming Derek's friend realized that Derek didn't have any money. Even if they introduced him to the arms dealer to buy those grenades, he had no money to buy them at all. And so the FBI agent and the informant cook up a pretty wild plot, and they come up with the idea of convincing Derek to trade his speakers. He had a set of old ratty stereo speakers that were really his only earthly possession of value, and to trade those speakers for the grenades. And so the informant tells Derek, he says, I talked to my guy, I think if you brought your stereo speakers and traded them for grenades, he'd be happy to give you those grenades. And I hope you'll go with me on this, because I don't know any arms dealers in real life, but I'm pretty sure that if the real arms dealers out there aren't going to take stereo speakers for grenades. But Derek didn't know this, and so Derek goes with the informant to a shopping mall in the parking lot where they're going to meet the arms dealer, who is, of course, an undercover FBI agent. And Derek dutifully brings over his stereo speakers and hands them to the undercover FBI agent, and the FBI agent then hands him over a box that has what he believes are grenades. In fact, they are grenades, but they're useless, they're inert. And as soon as he accepts them, police rush in and charge Derek with conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction. He ultimately pleaded guilty and is now serving, I believe, 17 years in prison for conspiring with an FBI informant to move forward in a terrorist plot that, on his own, he never could have conceived of or acquired the weapons to move forward in that sort of attack. And what's interesting about Derek's case, I believe, is that Derek isn't unique in this. There have been, since 9/11, more than 175 men like Derek who have been targeted by FBI informants in sting operations and then charged with charges such as conspiring to use a weapon of mass destruction. These are men who never had the capability on their own to move forward in a terrorist act, and in many cases never even had the idea for the attack themselves. These are ideas that were brought by the FBI informant or through the FBI informant by the FBI undercover agent. To understand why the FBI does this and continues to do this, we hear of sting announcements every 2 to 3 months in my experience from looking at these cases. But to understand why the FBI moves forward in these sting operations, I spent a lot of time interviewing FBI agents and trying to understand their rationale. And what they believe is that their job since 9/11 has been to catch terrorists before they strike, to catch the terrorists of today, to catch the terrorists of tomorrow today, for example. And that the threat to the United States has changed significantly since 9/11. So in 9/11, for example, what we saw was a group of trained, well-financed terrorists who had solid, documented connections to international groups overseas. The FBI today believes that as a result of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the capacity for a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda or one of its affiliates to launch an attack like we saw in 9/11 just doesn't really exist. Instead, what they fear exists is this idea of a lone wolf, someone who's in the United States already, sympathizes with the causes of international terrorism, and chooses at some point to step over that line from sympathizer to operator and move forward in an attack that can carry the Al-Qaeda black banner, so to speak. And at the same time, Al-Qaeda or its affiliates would have no idea that this was happening, but upon the launch of the attack, they could claim credit for it in some way. And so what the FBI does through these sting operations is try to identify the men like Derek Sharif who, given the opportunity, would move forward in a terrorist attack. And as I said, as a result of these sting operations, we have 175 men behind bars and convicted or awaiting trial as a result of their participation in these types of sting operations. And today, to understand the magnitude and the scope of the informant program, today, for example, the FBI has 15,000 informants on its payroll. How that compares, for example, to COINTELPRO and Hoover. I think when people think of the FBI and spying on American citizens, they think of the times in the 60s when the FBI was using informants in civil rights organizations. And at that time, the FBI had 1,500 informants Today they have 15,000. In fact, there are so many informants employed by the FBI that they've invested in software that allows them to track where the informants are and what their attributes are, and allow agents to essentially force trade informants. You know, if they have an informant of Somali descent and they are working a case where a Somali man would be helpful, they can transfer him from one city to another to work a case. And in fact, there are well-documented cases of informants moving just like that, city to city, to work these types of sting operations. And while there are 15,000 informants overall, what we can say without specificity is that the majority of those informants are focused on counterterrorism and specifically the threat of terrorism from within Muslim communities. You know, it's amazing to me, and I'm sure a lot to many people in the room today, that you know the FBI is so singularly focused on terrorism with Muslim communities when you consider the numbers. You know, the numbers just don't support the idea that terrorism from Muslim communities is the greatest threat to the United States. You know, if you look, for example, at right-wing groups, there have been more deaths by right-wing groups in the United States since 9/11 than by you know, men who have Al-Qaeda sympathies. You know, even more startling, I think, is the idea that, or the fact that more people have been killed by lone gunmen, like we saw in Connecticut or in Colorado, than have been killed by men with Al-Qaeda sympathies in the decade after 9/11. Nonetheless, that hasn't changed the fact that the FBI focuses almost singularly on Muslim communities when it searches for terrorists. And today, counterterrorism is the largest part of the FBI's budget. Every year, the FBI receives $3 billion from Congress to search for terrorists such as Derek Sharif. And they're searching for those terrorists primarily in these Muslim communities. And they're doing so in a very systematic way. The FBI uses a program called domain management that allows the Bureau to essentially map along ethnic and religious lines the entire United States. There was, for example, a meeting that was made public in 2006 among top FBI officials who were showing off domain management, and they showed a map of the San Francisco Bay Area and highlighted the areas within the San Francisco Bay Area where there were a higher concentration of Muslim residents. And Phil Mudd, who was a former FBI executive at the time, pointed to those highlighted areas and said, that's where we're hunting. And what he meant by that specifically is that's where they're sending in informants. That's where they're sending in informants to find people who are interested in committing some sort of act of terrorism. And these informants are not only going after people like Derek Sharif, people who are interested in committing an act of terrorism, but they're also going into mosques, into Muslim communities, looking for people who will be informants themselves, who will provide information to the FBI, and they're essentially trying to find any pressure points that they can. So in addition to having an FBI informant look for the Derek Sharifs, they're also looking for people who are well connected in Muslim communities, or people who know a lot of people more than anything else, and who have a certain vulnerability. And in Muslim communities, that can be immigration, for example. It's frequently the FBI uses immigration as leverage to get people to cooperate as informants. That is, if they find, for example, the person has shaky immigration grounds, they may use that as leverage to say, hey, you know, unless you work with us, you'll face deportation. Or if they are in the United States on solid ground, they may be trying to sponsor family to come over, and the FBI will use that as leverage against them. The FBI also will use embarrassing information such as financial problems, extramarital affairs, and anything it can find that it can use as leverage to recruit people as an informant. And that's why we're seeing the rapid rise in the numbers of informants, so the 15,000 number we have today. In fact, a common tactic, which was memorialized in FBI rules a couple of years ago, are what is known as trash covers, where the FBI will literally go through someone's trash looking for something that they can use as leverage to get them to cooperate, whether it might be, for example, evidence of that extramarital affair, or the financial problems, or perhaps the use of pornography, anything and everything that might be a pressure point that they could use to get that person to cooperate. And you know, to give you an example of how this works in a really real way, as far as a terrorism sting operation, there was a case outside New York City that got a lot of attention, and I'm sure a lot of you know about it, called the Newburgh Four. And this was a case where the FBI sent in one of its most prolific informants, a man named Shahed Hussein, who fled Pakistan on murder charges and then was hung up on fraud charges and then became an FBI informant. So not exactly the nicest guy, as you might imagine. They sent him into Newburgh outside New York, and he literally trolled the mosques in the city for 9 months, looking for someone who was interested in committing an act of terrorism. And for 9 months, he found no one. In fact, he went to one of the mosques so frequently that they offered to, they invited him to join the board of directors. But yet, after 9 months, after being in this community for so long and finding no one interested in committing an act of terrorism, Shahed Hussein winds up meeting in the parking lot a man named James Cromedy. And James was an African-American convert to Islam whose understanding of the religion was crude and elementary, and at the same time had a real history of mental illness and mental problems. We don't know exactly what was said during the budding of their relationship, because for the first 6 months that James Cromedy and the informant Shahed Hussein were together, none of those none of those conversations were recorded. But what we do know is that after 6 months, James Cromedy is caught on tape saying very anti-Semitic things, and the informant is also caught on tape leading him on, encouraging him to some sort of act of violence. And in fact, in one conversation, tells James Cromedy that he's a member of Jaish-e-Mohammed, one of the better-known terrorist organizations in the world. Kind of amusingly, James Cromedy, upon hearing of Jaish-e-Mohammed, has no idea what this group is, and asks, well, what does that mean? Are you Muslim? And the informant says, well, of course we're Muslim. This gives you an idea of the level of sophistication James Cromedy had, and particularly his level of knowledge of terrorist organizations. Yet that wasn't enough for the FBI to say, this guy probably isn't dangerous. Instead, they continued on for months, urging him to move forward in a terrorist plot. James Cromedy recruited 3 of his friends to get involved in a plot that the informant had come up with to bomb synagogues in the Bronx and fire Stinger missiles. The weapons would be provided by the FBI, of course, fire Stinger missiles at planes taking off from the local airport. About halfway through the plot, they began to realize that James Cromedy might not move forward with it. They might back out. And the FBI was really concerned that, look, we've spent all this time and all this money, pursuing this would-be terrorist, and if he backs out, we've got nothing to show for it. So the FBI decided that they wanted a backup plan, and they proposed to the informant to go to James and get him to buy a gun in New York. James was a felon whose Second Amendment rights hadn't been restored, and of course, if he had possession of a gun, that would have been a federal offense that could have sent him back to prison. So the informant gives James $500 and says, look, go into New York and buy a gun. James looked up to the informant. He believed that he was he believed that he was someone that he wanted to impress, and so James goes into New York with $500 in his pocket and tries to buy a gun. He knew of a friend who was a drug dealer, and he thought maybe he could buy a gun from him, so he goes to him and no dice. He spends the whole night in and around Manhattan and Brooklyn looking to buy a gun and can't buy one. And then comes back the next day and, I imagine, because this wasn't on video, but I can only imagine it in my mind, where he's got his chin down and he's sad and he says, oh, here's your $500 back, I couldn't buy you a gun. And of course, this is a man who would be later portrayed as a person who was about to bomb synagogues in the Bronx and was affiliated with an international terrorist group, and here he is unable to buy a gun in Manhattan and Brooklyn with $500 in his pocket. So clearly this isn't a man who is very dangerous on his own. And yet the FBI continued to move forward in the sting operation, and ultimately, with James Cromedy and his 3 friends, moved forward in a plot to bomb synagogues in the Bronx. They placed bombs in cars they believed had been parked there by terrorist operatives. In fact, they were rental cars parked there by FBI agents. And upon placing their bombs, which the FBI, of course, provided, in these cars that were in front of the synagogue, the FBI agents rushed in, arrested James Cromedy and his friends, and they were convicted at trial and are now sentenced to 30 years in prison. At trial, at the sentencing, the judge, Colleen McMahon, commented that she believed James Cromedy's buffoonery was so Shakespearean in scope that if there were a real terrorist out there looking to recruit someone to help him with a plot, they would have passed right over James Cromedy. And I think that's true for every one of these men caught in terrorism sting operations. These tend to be men who are mentally ill, economically desperate, men who are on the fringes of U.S. Muslim communities, and they're easily manipulated by FBI informants who move them along in a sting operation. What's significant about these cases is the question of entrapment always comes up. I mean, obviously, to a layman, when they see a case like this, it seems clear that here's a man who got involved in a terrorism plot, had no means of moving forward in that plot on his own, and it was only through an FBI informant that that plot was made possible. It's only by the FBI that plot was made possible. But what we've seen is that in 10 cases, 10 defendants have formally argued entrapment at trial, and none has been successful. Part of this is that it's difficult to argue entrapment in any case because it requires the jury to be sympathetic to the defendant, or I should say empathetic, to believe that none of this would have happened were it not for the FBI making it possible for it to happen. And here's a poor guy who got trapped in this case. And where I think the FBI and the Department of Justice have significantly maneuvered around the entrapment argument is through the scale of the plots involved. If you look at these cases, none of these men are capable of committing acts of terrorism on their own. Even small ones. Derek Sharif, the man I mentioned in the beginning, for example, says to the informant in a recorded conversation, if it wasn't for you, I probably just would have ended up stabbing someone with a steak knife. That was his capacity. At worst, this man, if he wanted to commit acts of violence, would have stabbed a stranger with a steak knife. That's an awful thing, but it's a lot different than attacking shopping mall with grenades. And yet, the FBI in these sting operations could choose a less ambitious plot. Could say to someone, why don't you take this gun, go into a shopping mall and shoot someone in the knee. Awful as it is, not exactly a terror plot that's going to scare the rest of the United States. Instead, what the FBI does is give people the opportunity to commit these terrorist acts of horrific scale. Bombing synagogues, for example, or taking a bomb into a subway system at rush hour, or building a car bomb, provided all by the FBI, and then having them park it in a downtown skyscraper during work hours that, if it were real, would have destroyed the building and killed at least thousands of people inside. And I think what this effectively does is overwhelm the jury. It allows them to not see entrapment in these cases because they think, I've used that subway system, my brother works in that building, and it requires in the jury an extra level to be empathetic to. I mean, in a sense, it makes it almost impossible to be empathetic to this person who was going to commit this horrific act of terrorism. And I think that's what ends up happening in these entrapment cases. At the same time, defense attorneys are able to argue that he wasn't predisposed to commit the crime. In any entrapment case, you have to prove that someone was predisposed to commit the crime. In any sting operation, you have to prove that he was predisposed to commit the crime. So, in let's say a sting operation involving people who want to rob a bank, the prosecution would have to show that the people caught in the sting operation were researching how to rob a bank, were interested in robbing a bank, did something and made some action to suggest that this is what they wanted to do. In terrorism cases, for example, you can't exactly show that the person tried to commit an act of terrorism before he got involved in sting operation. So what they've done is they experts on the stand, or so-called experts with credentials that I would argue are quite dubious, and they have them testify that this person watched a militant jihadi video, for example, or was on an online forum affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and that means with a kind of voodoo angle that he's going to become a terrorist overnight. Obviously that's ridiculous, but that's the type of evidence of predisposition that the government uses. And so far it's worked. So far no jury has been willing to throw these cases out, and at the same time what we see is a very high level of guilty pleas, in large part because in many ways the FBI stacks the cards against defendants through mandatory minimum sentences that if they go to trial are just draconian. So for example, in some of these cases, actually a large number of cases, you'll see the use of a Stinger missile, where anyone in the United States could obtain a Stinger missile. Even the most sophisticated criminal organization probably couldn't obtain one, but lo and behold, in these sting operations, there's a lot of Stinger missiles. And a big part of that is that the use of Stinger missiles kicks in a mandatory minimum sentence in the 35-year ballpark. So if you're charged with a conspiracy to commit an act of terrorism and it involved a Stinger missile, you're looking at yourself and thinking, well, if I go to trial, I could be facing 35 years. Whereas if I take this plea deal, I'll go to jail for 11 or 12. And in 87%, I think is the current percentage of cases, that's what we see, men choosing to plead guilty. And as a result of that, we find out less and less about what goes on and the sometimes questionable behavior of the FBI in these sting operations, because the most that we know of these cases are the ones that go to trial where the evidence is brought to light. And what's most significant, I think, about these sting operations is that they ultimately justify the FBI policies on counterterrorism. And to say this pretty specifically, the FBI, as I mentioned, every year gets $3 billion to fight terrorism, to find the next terrorist, so to speak. And every year, former Director Robert Mueller and the new FBI Director will obviously do the same thing, have gone to Congress to justify the budget, to say, look at us, let me tell you how we're doing so great, keeping you safe against terrorism. And when Robert Mueller testifies, he brings up specific cases. And one of the cases he almost always brings up, or has always brought up, is the case of James Cromedy. And he tells Congress how here was James Cromedy, affiliated with Jaish-e-Mohammed, and he would plot it with 4 other men to bomb synagogues in the Bronx, and that would have been awful, but we stopped it. What he doesn't tell Congress is that James Cromedy couldn't buy that gun with $500 in his pocket. He never had the capacity to move forward in his act of terrorism, and in fact never had the idea at all. It was the FBI informant who came up with the idea. And yet, his story, as told by Robert Mueller, is compelling enough to the public that compelling enough to Congress that ultimately, year after year, they approve these massive budgets for counterterrorism, which then build in pressure all along the system. So, the FBI, has very much transformed into an intelligence agency since 9/11, but it measures its success using the metrics of traditional law enforcement. And traditional law enforcement measures its success through arrests made. So, for example, if you're, the local police department in Phoenix, and you're on the car theft squad, you're looking at your numbers and how many people did you catch, how many cars did you prevent from being stolen, all the things that I think are probably okay to use as metrics for success when you're talking about stolen cars. When you're talking about terrorism, it's quite a different thing. And so what happens, but it's applied the same way in the FBI. So what happens is that from the top levels of the FBI, Robert Mueller pressures his field offices to come up with terrorism cases. Those field offices then pressure their terrorism agents to come up with cases, and then those counterterrorism agents in turn pressure their informants to find me a case, find me a would-be terrorist. And instead of finding truly dangerous people who are about to launch an attack, they're finding easily manipulated, mentally ill people that they can lure into an attack. For example, when you look at the cases of terrorism cases in the decade after 9/11, there were more than 500 prosecutions of international terrorism cases. Of those 500, there were more than 150 sting operations, and yet, of those 500, there were only about 5 people that you can point to and say, that was a really dangerous guy who would have done really terrible things had he had the chance. For example, Faisal Shahzad, I'm sure you remember, tried to deliver a car bomb to Times Square in 2010, and unfortunately didn't go off. Or Najib al-Azazi tried to bomb the New York City subway system around the same time, fortunately was unsuccessful. And yet neither of these men were targeted in sting operations. Just like, for example, most recently, Tamerlan Tsarnaev in Boston. What we find is that the truly dangerous people aren't caught up in these sting operations, in part because finding them is really hard. But finding the person who is easily manipulated, the James Cromedy, who's mentally ill, doesn't really have many friends, and for the first time in his life has someone who's paying attention to him, this is a guy who can be easily manipulated. And that's really the profile of the terrorist that we see. And because of this, it has really amplified the number of cases, or grossly inflated, I should say, the number of cases of terrorism in the United States. So often, when you hear of a terrorism case, almost, to me it's like a Mad Libs when I read the affidavit. I can almost tell exactly whether this was a real case or whether this was a sting case because of the use of the informant, the references to the person's inability to get guns on their own. But what this does in a general sense, is amplify the threat of terrorism to the wider community. When the media reports on any crime story, it's always the law enforcement that controls the narrative. For example, let's say you're dealing with, to use the same analogy, a bank robbery story, and the bank robbers were successful. That first day story you're going to read in the Arizona Republic is going to rely almost exclusively on information from law enforcement, and it's not going to be until a few days later that you start to get more information, a more nuanced view of what happened. In terrorism cases, the exact same principle applies. That is to say that upon the announcement of a terrorism case, the media is getting its information almost exclusively from law enforcement. And the first day story, the one that's on the front page, the one that makes the nightly news, ends up being the horrific one. The narrative of how he almost moved forward in this terrorism plot that would have killed thousands of people. It's a horrifying story. But then only a few days later, after the story's off the front page and no longer on the nightly news, do you realize that the person really wasn't capable of all of these things, and it was a far more nuanced story than was originally shown. At the same time, most Americans are only going to see that first day story. And so these sting operations, in a very real way, amplify and exaggerate the threat of terrorism within the United States, and particularly within Muslim communities, giving what I would argue across the United States a perception that a great threat of terrorism exists within Muslim communities that does not in fact exist because of the way these cases have amplified that threat. I think, for the purposes of the audience today and how this affects you, in addition to that effect, that artificial perception that there is a great threat of terrorism from within U.S. Muslim communities, what U.S. Muslim communities also face is a singular targeting by law enforcement that I don't think we've ever really seen before, and might be kind of most analogous to what Japanese Americans faced during World War II. And that is that law enforcement are targeting Muslim communities not because they fear that they will commit terrorism based on any specific evidence, but that they fear they will harbor terrorists or be involved with some terrorist organization just because they're Muslim. And that is perfectly legal under the current FBI rules and perfectly acceptable. And what we see is that the FBI is targeting Muslim communities by going into those communities trying to build informants. And I think this has created a couple of things. I mean, one is that it's created essentially an atmosphere of siege for Muslim communities. I've heard members of Muslim communities around the country talk about and say this jokingly, when I pray on Friday, I just assume that the person next to me is an informant. There have been imams who have been targeted for recruitment as informants, who have been pressured to be informants. And I just can't imagine that this would be tolerated if it were a rabbi or a Catholic priest, or if it was the Catholic Church or the synagogues that were fearing that every time they worshipped, they had informants among them. Yet this is allowed in Muslim communities to a great effect. And what I would argue is that this has created very much kind of a siege mentality within Muslim communities, that it's hard. It's hard now to want to cooperate with law enforcement because of fear of being recruited for being an informant yourself, while at the same time a fear of being targeted for any type of investigation. And I also think this is a really poor type of law enforcement. The best information about any community is going to come from members of that community. It's going to come from the business leaders, it's going to come from the religious leaders, it's going to come from people who know that community inside and out. And yet what we have now is our Muslim communities that are disinterested and untrusting of law enforcement, and may be unwilling to provide information that would be valuable to law enforcement, whether it's about terrorism or any other kind of matter. While at the same time, the FBI is recruiting criminals and con artists as informants who are then being paid to provide information, and they have a direct incentive to find terrorists, to find information related to terrorism, not because that information is true, but because they get paid for that information. And I think that's partially why we see such an exaggerated effect in these cases. The last thing I'll try to leave this with, and I'll try to wrap this up shortly, because I think kind of going on here. But one of the questions I've asked myself, and I am not Muslim, but I thought to myself, like, what would I, if I were Muslim, and how would I feel about these programs if they were to affect my community in this way? And there was a part of me that thought, well, is it worth it if it really works? Is it worth it if it prevents acts of terrorism? Like, is this temporary targeting of FBI worth it in that way because it somehow saves lives and is for this greater good? And I don't know how I would answer that if that were true, but what I can say is that it's not. And we know that for sure from the Boston Marathon case. What's particularly interesting about the Boston Marathon case is that in the same month that the FBI learned of Tamlin Tsarnaev, which was January 2011, and investigated him and realized that he was not a threat, the FBI, through an informant who was a heroin addict, targeted a man who aspired to fly a remote-controlled airplane into the Capitol building, have it loaded with grenades, and destroy the gold dome of the Capitol in Washington. I mean, obviously on its face, this sounds like the villain of a Batman comic book. But this man, Reswan Firdaus, really thought he could do this. Of course, he didn't have any money, he didn't have any resources, he didn't have a plane, he had no way to ever pull off this crime. And yet the FBI, through the informant, in January 2011, decided not to pursue Tamlin Tsarnaev, but instead chose to pursue Reswan Firdaus. And they gave him $4,000, they rented a storage locker, they paid for a trip to Washington, D.C. to have him scout out locations from which to launch his plane. And then in the final stage, when they provided the explosives that he would need for his airplane, they then arrested him and charged him with conspiracy to destroy a federal building and conspiracy to move forward in an act of terrorism. And he's now serving, I believe, 14 years in prison. And here's a man who, on his own, never had the capacity to commit an act of violence, and yet, the same month, he was brought to the FBI's attention, the same month that Tamlin Tsarnaev was, and the FBI, like Najib al-Azazi and like Faiz Azad, totally missed him. And so I think there's a really compelling argument to make that these sting operations, while they do find people who can be prosecuted successfully for terrorism charges, these sting operations are not keeping us any safer and are not identifying real terrorists. Instead, who they're identifying and whose prosecutions they ultimately result in are people who are on the fringes of Muslim communities, very easily manipulated and easily brought into terrorism plots that on their own, they never could have committed. So again, thank you so much for having me and accommodating this as a web chat. If there's any questions, I'd certainly like to use my remaining time for those.
Once again, I want to thank you, Trevor, for this very informative talk. We're going to take a few minutes to take your questions, so if you have any questions, we're going to have another volunteer go around with the mic.
Thank you so much for being here. It's really, really enlightening to kind of hear your studies and all the research that you've done. I'm wondering, through all your study of all these cases, if you yourself know of a more effective way for the FBI to use its resources to actually do the work that they're supposed to be doing, which is helping to protect our citizens in our country. Instead of this, like you said, these highly and easily prosecutable cases of people who really are not capable of doing anything on their own.